Hi, everybody. This is Clark Boyd, technology correspondent for The World. Now, The World is a co-production of the BBC World Service in London, Public Radio International, and WGBH Public Radio in the United States. We air Monday through Friday on about 280 stations across the public radio network in the United States. The point of the show is to cover international news for a U.S. audience. It just so happens that I'm based here in Brussels, and as I said, I cover technology for the show. And I've been following developments in Tunisia, especially the online back and forth between the Tunisian government, Tunisian protesters, and of course groups from outside like Anonymous, who have been attacking Tunisian government sites in solidarity with the protesters in Tunisia. So as part of a piece that I did, I interviewed Marietje Schaake, who is a member of the European Parliament. She's a member of the Dutch Liberal Party, and she follows net freedom issues closely. I used one short clip from our interview in the piece that I did, but there seems to be some interest out there in having the full version of the interview. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to her, because she was one of the first and really one of the only members of the European Parliament to really speak out on what's going on in Tunisia. So I contacted her and went along to her office yesterday and recorded this interview. Bear in mind that I'm reporting for an American audience, not a European audience. So if some of the questions that I ask seem maybe a bit basic to some of you who are listening to this, it's just because the knowledge level about how the European Union works is, a little bit different in the United States than it is here, or maybe it isn't. But anyway, here's the interview with Marietje Schaake, and I just started by asking what motivated her to start writing and speaking about what's going on in Tunisia. Here we go.
Well, I'm generally very focused on net freedom, freedom of expression, and I believe that the struggle for human rights is really increasingly moving online. And as I'm active myself on social networks such as Twitter, where a global network of people exchanges ideas, the uprisings in Tunisia have been discussed there for the past weeks, and I was surprised that traditional media, such as newspapers and television news, even radio, have not spent much attention on it. So I thought it would be time to change this and ask questions to Catherine Ashton, what the EU response would be, and also bring it to other people's attention through an op-ed in the newspaper, because I think what's happening in Tunisia is quite unique.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what is happening in Tunisia. There have been riots in the streets, government crackdown on protesters, and all of this has also moved online as well.
Yeah, it's really a struggle that's also taking place online, where groups of hackers, a group known as Anonymous, which was also active in taking revenge for companies' actions against WikiLeaks website, is now also taking revenge against the Tunisian government for limiting freedom of expression on the internet, or internet freedom, to the extent that they have. And then in return, the Tunisian government is shutting down websites such as Google and Facebook, but also there are complaints of people who say that their accounts on Facebook and email have been taken over, and they're accusing the Tunisian government. So it's really a struggle that's taking place online as much as it is in the streets.
One of the interesting things about it is usually when internet censorship comes up, people naturally think Iran, China, countries like that. But actually, when you look at the research that's been done by groups about some of the worst offenders in the world as far as what people can and can't see online, Tunisia is always up there as well. So it's in some ways, it's not a new problem in Tunisia.
No, it isn't. And we should be very vigilant, not only when there's protests and when there's, let's say, peaks of visibility in censorship. It's a serious problem that also creeps up on people. It's sometimes unknown to what extent governments are spying on citizens, limiting access to information, manipulating access to information, and using even more sophisticated surveillance technologies and spying technologies on their own citizens. And I'm afraid that politicians in repressive regimes are sometimes more aware and more advanced in the use of new technologies than politicians in the EU and the US are. And this is a real problem. So it's now time that the EU takes a leadership position in defending internet freedom, but it requires an enormous updating of knowledge on the part of politicians. And we also have to be aware that the laws we make are always lagging behind technological developments. So we should use the basis of fundamental freedoms for a framework and not over-regulate, but be very much aware of the way in which repressive regimes are cracking down on their own citizens and limiting their rights to freedom of expression through the internet.
So what can the EU do then in a situation like Tunisia? What pressure could be brought to bear to get the government to maybe ease up on the censorship online?
Well, I believe that Tunisia is very interested in better relations with the EU, for example, in working together in trade relations, but also in working on migration issues. And so they should put their behavior in line with agreements that have already been made. Relations between the EU and third countries always involve basic levels of democratic rights, human rights, and minority rights, for example. And it's just a matter of the EU also underlining that the internet is a part of this. So to show to Tunisia that it sees the level of censorship, that it's aware of the crackdown on the virtual networks instead of just on the streets or in the offline world. And we should also be very much aware of our trade policies. In Iran, for example, where in the summer of 2009, the internet played a huge role both in empowering the opposition movement, but also in the way the government cracked down on it in return. We learned that a lot of the surveillance and the spying and the wiretapping of citizens happened via the mobile network. This mobile network was provided to the Iranian government by Nokia Siemens Networks, which is a European company. And this company did not act illegally. However, the rules that apply to manufacturing technologies here assume that there's, for example, division of powers, that there are checks and balances, that the rule of law is in place before technologies can be used to see where people are. For example, if a child goes missing here in Europe, it's possible for the police to use the signal of a mobile phone to find this child, and this is legitimate and needs a police warrant or possibly a legal warrant from a judge. But these checks and balances are not in place in countries like Iran or Tunisia. And so we need to be aware what technological standards we export and what the consequences are. And by doing a human rights impact assessment, for example, which is what I proposed to do when we enforce trade relations between the EU and third countries, we should assess what impact technologies have in the hands of repressive regimes.
In your op-ed, you, especially at the end, you talked about how the lack of any of the major Western powers coming out and taking a stance on the Tunisia issue actually means that the European Union needs to be there in a leadership role.
Yes, absolutely. I believe the EU is a community of values, and it should lead in the world when it comes to internet freedom, because, as I mentioned, the struggle for human rights is moving online. So it's simply a translation of policies we already have, which is to defend people's human rights across the world, because we believe they're universal. And considering the impact that new technologies have, both in fostering more human rights, enabling people to raise their own voices to defend themselves, and in the way governments and others could use these technologies to repress people. And I think it's high time that the EU takes a leading position. The United States has spoken out with an ambition to be a global leader in defending internet freedom. But when we look at the crackdown after the WikiLeaks publications, then I think the US is quickly losing its leadership position and its credibility when it comes to defending fundamental freedoms. And this underlines the momentum for the EU even more strongly.
Do you think that close ties between Tunisia and many EU member states makes this a little bit dicey as far as, wanting to crack down and take a strong stance against what the Tunisian government is doing?
Well, I would like to look at it as an opportunity. I think that Tunisia has an interest in close relations with both the EU and the US. And it's a simple requirement for the Tunisian government to then comply with human rights. And the EU should vigilantly remind them. But the fact that they would like to have good relations is shared by the EU. But this means that there's a respect for citizens' rights. And if not, then there should be serious consequences.
Apart from sort of impact assessments or trade and things like that, are there concrete things that the European Union can do to help people, at least in Tunisia, keep getting the word out about what's going on there?
Well, I think that's very important. I see that citizens across the world who care about internet freedom are really supporting the Tunisian opposition movement. We even see that there has been an inspiring effect going to Egypt, for example, where supporters of the Tunisian opposition also took to the streets, which is a very, very interesting development, which I think we should follow. And it is up to us in Europe and elsewhere to amplify the voices of citizens in their peaceful demand for freedom. And that's something we should do anyway, and you don't have to be a politician to do so. But as politicians, we have an additional responsibility to really use the tools and the relations with Tunisia that are available to push for respect for people's rights and to be very, very clear about it, and not to have trade interests or other economic interests or strategic interests overtake this very fundamental principle.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that's Marietje Schaake, a member of the European Parliament from the Dutch Liberal Party, speaking to me here in Brussels on Thursday, January 6th. If you want to find out more about our program, you can come to theworld.org. I host a weekly technology podcast as well, and have been doing it now for about 6 years. It's at theworld.org/technology. Check it out if you get a chance. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.